Well, hello and welcome to our devotion for reading through the Bible in a year in the one-year Bible. And as we get started tonight, we will look at Romans chapter 8, 26 through 39, which you might recognize has many different, very famous passages. We'll look at the one in verse 28, often quoted. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Here, Paul brings this whole section that we've been talking about in Romans all together. In spite of our present sufferings, in spite of our groaning, even though we go through all of that, nevertheless, we know that for the ones loving God, all things work together for good. It might be surprising that Paul begins by describing Christians in an active sense, because this is even the first time that Paul in Romans uses the Greek verb for to love. You would expect that Paul would describe us passively as those who have been given God's love, grace, and mercy. Yet here we are portrayed in active terms as those who have responded to the love which God has poured into our hearts by loving God in return. There is, however, a good Old Testament precedent for describing God's people in this way. Our love for God here is not a condition, nor is it a legalistic requirement. Instead, whenever human love for God exists, the Bible makes it clear that God acted first, loved us first, poured out his gracious gifts upon us first. Our love for God is always a response to him who first loved us. When it comes to all things working together for good for those who love God, it's a little bit like a game of ping pong, because we have to keep going back and forth between a misunderstanding of this passage, which many people have misunderstood it or misquoted it, and failing to say exactly what this passage says, because it does say a great deal. So we need to be careful as we look at it so that we don't overstate it or understate it. So that's what we're going to do here in this little devotion. So it is important to understand that not all things are good. And that doesn't mean that everything which happens in our fallen world comes directly from the hand of God, as if he could be blamed for every wickedness or malaise that we encounter. Yet this does not dismiss the biblical teaching that our omnipotent God remains in control over his entire creation, even over the forces of evil. The point is that many tragic events in our world are simply the result of sin and of creation's enslavement to sin, and these things seem from our human perspective to be contrary to the good will of God. So sickness, cancer, death, terrorist attacks, natural disasters, and all other calamities are not good in and of themselves. Apart from divine revelation, we are not able to identify God as the direct cause of them. Why a gracious God nevertheless allows them often remains hidden from us. But in the face of even the direst of circumstances, Scripture affirms that God is in control, and his control over evil is so complete that he could even claim it, or maybe reclaim it, for God's purposes. So this verse reminds us of how God certainly intends to work good out of the good things with which he blesses us in this life. So God provides all good things. The psalmist praises God by saying, "The eyes of all look to you, and you give them their food in due season. You open your hand, you satisfy the desires of every living thing." Of course, this goes beyond our modern day materialistic mindset to include things that are much more important than, for example, acquiring money, etc., etc. So God works good through good things. However, there's more to it than that. God also promises to work good even out of the evil events which inevitably occur in our sinful fallen world. And this is a great comfort to us. Then, as the verse concludes, Paul describes the ones loving God. They are the ones who are called by God. That means that we, as baptized believers, have our love for God spring forth from God and spring forth from who God has made us to be in Jesus Christ. Love flows from hearts that have been made new in accordance with God's resolve, will, plan, and purpose, which come to fruition in our salvation. So, the ones for whom all things work together toward ultimate good in eternity are the ones who love God in the present time. The ones who love God in the present time were called by him earlier in history, and all who have been called were so called in accordance with God's purpose and election in eternity past. There is a lot more that we could say about that, but we will get to that before too long here in the book of Romans. May God be with you and bless you.